What's going on, chat? Long time no see. This weekend, as I said, I went out of town. I went to a wedding. Pretty limited on time, so could not squeeze a book or a reading here and there. But it's time to catch up now. That's including Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and today. So hopefully I can squeeze in a couple videos today. If not, we'll catch up tomorrow. But let's waste no more time and let's get straight into it. As a reminder, we're reading Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell. Levine's argument started with an insight that came from one of his graduate students, Hee-Sun Park. It was right at the beginning of Levine's research, when he was as baffled as the rest of his professors about why we are all so bad at something that, by rights, we should be good at. Her big insight, the first one, was that the 54% deception accuracy figure was averaging across truths and lies. Levine said, "You come to a very different understanding if you break out. How much people are right on truths and how much are right on lies." What he meant was this. If I tell you that your accuracy rate on Levine's videos is right about 50%, the natural assumption is to think that you are just randomly guessing, that you have no idea what you are doing. But Park's observations was that that's not true. We're much better than chance at correctly identifying the students who are telling the truth, but we are much worse than chance at correctly identifying the students who are lying. We go through all those videos and we guess true, which means we get most of the truthful interviews right and most of the liars wrong. We have a default to truth. Our operating assumption is that the people we are dealing with are honest. Levine says his own experiment is an almost perfect illusion of this phenomenon. He invites people to play a trivia game for money. Suddenly, the instructor is called out of the room, and she just happens to leave the answers to the test in plain view on her desk. Levine says that logically the subject should roll their eyes at this point. These are college students. They're not stupid. They've signed up for a psychological experiment. They are given a partner whom they've never met, who's edging them on to cheat. You would think that they might be a little suspicious that things are not as they seem, but no. Sometimes they catch that professor leaving the room right might be a setup. Levine says the thing they almost never catch is that their partners are fake, so they think that there might be hidden agendas. They think it might be a setup because experiments are setups, right? But this nice person they are talking and chatting to, oh no, they never question it. To snap out of truth default mode requires what Levine calls a trigger. A trigger is not the same as a suspicion or the first sliver of doubt. We fall out of truth default mode only when the case against our initial assumption becomes definitive. We do not behave, in other words, like sober-minded scientists, slowly gathering evidence of the truth or falsity of something before reaching a conclusion. We do the opposite. We start by believing, and we stop believing when our doubts and misgivings rise to the point where we can no longer explain them away. This proposition sounds at first like the kind of hair splitting that social scientists like to engage in. It is not. It's a profound point that explains a lot of otherwise puzzling behavior. Consider, for example, one of the most famous findings in all of psychology, Stanley Milgram's obedience experiment. In 1961, Milgram recruited volunteers from New Haven to take part in what he said was a memory experiment. Each was met by a sober, imposing young man named John Williams, who explained that they were going to play the role of teacher in the experiment. Williams introduced them to another volunteer, a pleasant middle-aged man named Mr. Wallace. Mr. Wallace, they were told, was to be the learner. He would sit in an adjoining room wired to a complicated apparatus capable of delivering electrical shocks up to 450 volts. If you are curious about what 450 volts feels like, it's just shy of the amount of electrical shock that leaves tissue damage. The teacher volunteer was instructed to give the learner a series of memory tasks, and each time the learner failed, the volunteer was to punish him with a ever greater electrical shock. in order to see whether the threat of punishment affected someone's ability to perform memory tasks. As the shocks escalated, Wallace would cry out in pain, and ultimately he started hammering on the walls. But if the teacher waved, the imposing instructor would urge them on. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. The reason the experiment is so famous is that virtually all of the volunteers complied. 65% ended up administering the maximum dose to the hapless learner. In the wake of the Second World War and the revelations about what German guards had been ordered to do in Nazi concentration camps, Milgram's finding caused a sensation. But to Levine, there's a second lesson to the experiment. The volunteer shows up and meets the imposing young John Williams. He was actually a local high school biology teacher chosen in Milgram's words because he was technical looking and dry, the type you would later see on television in connection with the space program. Everything Williams said during the experiment had been memorized from a script written by Milgram himself. Mr. Wallace was in fact a man named Jim McDonald. He worked for a railroad. Milgram liked him for the part of victim because he was mild and submissive. His cries of agony were taped and played over a loudspeaker. The experiment was a little amateur theatrical production, and the word amateur here is crucial. The Milgram experiment was not produced for a Broadway stage. Mr. Wallace, by Milgram's own deception, was a terrible actor. And everything about the experiment was, to put it mildly, more than a little far-fetched. The electrical shock machine didn't actually give shocks. More than one participant saw the loudspeaker in the corner and wondered why Wallace's cries were coming from there, not from behind the door to the room where Wallace was strapped in. And if the purpose of the experiment was to measure learning, why on earth did Williams spend the entire time with the teacher and not behind the door with the learner? Didn't that make it obvious that what he would really wanted to do was observe the people inflicting the pain, not the person receiving the pain? As hoaxes go, the Milgram experiment was pretty transparent, and just as with Levine's trivia test, people fell for it. They defaulted to truth. I actually checked the death notices in the New Haven Register for at least 2 weeks after the experiment to see if I had been involved and contributing factor in the death of the so-called learner. I was very relieved that his name did not appear. One subject wrote to Milgram in a follow-up questionnaire. Another wrote, "Believe me, when no response came from Mr. Wallace with the stronger voltage, I really believe the man was probably dead." There are adults, not callow undergrads, who were apparently conceived that a prejudiced institution of higher learning would run a possibly lethal torture operation in one of its basements. The experiment left such an effect on me, another wrote, that I spent the night in a cold sweat and nightmares because of the fear that I might have killed that man in the chair. But here's the crucial detail. Milgram's subjects weren't hopelessly gullible. They had doubts, lots of doubts, in her fascinating history of the obedience experiments behind the shock machine. Gina Perry interviews a retired tool maker named Joe Dimo, who was one of Milgram's original subjects. I thought, this is bizarre. Dimo became conceived that Wallace was faking it. I said I didn't know exactly what was going on, but I had my suspicion about it. I thought, if I'm right in my suspicions, then he, the learner, is in conclusion with them. He must be, and I'm not delivering shocks at all. He's just holding out every once in a while. But then Mr. Wallace came out of the locked room at the end of the experiment and put on a little act. He looked, Dimos remembers, haggard and emotional. He came in with a handkerchief in his hand, wiping his face. He came to me and offered his hand to shake hands with me, and he said, "I want to thank you for stopping it." When he came in, I thought, wow, maybe it really was true. Dewey was pretty sure that he was being lied to, but all it took was for one of the liars to extend the pres- pre- pretense a little longer, look a little upset, and mop his brow with a handkerchief, and Dewey folded his cards. Just look at the full statistics from the Milgram's experiment. Over 40% of the volunteers picked up on something odd, something that suggested the experiment was not what it seemed, but those doubts just weren't enough to trigger them out of truth default. That is Levine's point. You believe someone not because you have no doubts about them. Belief is not the absence of doubt. You believe someone because you don't have enough doubts about them. I'm going to come back to the distinction between some doubts and enough doubts because I think it's crucial. Just think about how many times you have criticized someone else in hindsight for their failure to spot a lie. To spot a liar, you should have known there were all kinds of red flags. You had doubts. Levine would say that's the wrong way to think about the problem. The right question is, were there enough red flags to push you over the threshold of belief? If there weren't, then by defaulting to truth, you were only being human. For some reason, that made me think of, when you're in a relationship and let's say you are seeing a lot of these red flags, you have a lot of these doubts, but let's say you've seen them before and it turned out for the better, or the other way around where these red flags are way too much and you have to result of, this is enough for me. But on the aspect of, seeing people change or seeing the doubts not overcome, you folding your cards, really makes me think of, the human aspect of wanting people to change or seeing the real value behind those red flags, or like looking at those red flags and saying, they're there, I acknowledge them, but I still see a great person. I'm willing to make a change, or I'm willing to adapt to the fact that these red flags are only perhaps temporary and I could help, navigate them or something like that. You know what I mean? I would say that that's a lot in relationships, but when it comes to strangers, I would say that those red flags or those doubts come more stronger. They're a little bit more stronger because you're just, at least for me, because you're meeting this person for the first time. And if you start to see these red flags, you would say, maybe this is not the right person for me. But yeah, like I said, I'll continue on for the catching up that I have to do. But until then, I'll see you next time.